It is good to see everyone here tonight, and certainly grateful for those who are watching at home. If you're able, we were looking this morning at what it means to be a part of the land of the free, and what that means in a scriptural sense of the term of being free from sin. And certainly there's no greater place to be than to make that decision to become a Christian in the biblical sense, to study what it means to repent, to study what it means to be baptized, and therefore, as we see in Acts chapter 2, to have the Lord add you to the only church that we find in the New Testament. And so what a great place that is to be, and to be able to secure our place for all eternity, to make decisions in this life to secure it for the next one. And I'm glad Isaiah led that song. I didn't tell him what to lead, but it really has a lot to do with what we're going to be studying here tonight. And we're going to be in Romans again. I know we looked a great deal at Romans this morning. We're going to be in there again in chapter 1. But in order to get people to the land of the free, and certainly that takes a lot of our own decision making, a lot of our own studying, getting to know our Bibles, being in the mindset where I am not too proud to change, or that I'm not, that if I see something that I might not understand, that maybe it's different than how I've understood in the past, to take that step to trust the Bible and the Bible only. And for a lot of us, that means to do things and to make decisions that can be difficult. There things to look at things in a way that I might not have before, but to accept Bible authority and to be willing to change because of it. But in order to get people to the land of the free, we need people who are already there to step up. That is how that land of the free is going to grow. In other words, we need the church to be a home of the brave. And it is going to take brave people to try to get other people to heaven. It is going to take, when you look at Paul, I can't think of a better example for us than to see someone courageously work the way that he did. And of course, we have a lot of great workers in the Bible, a lot of great women, a lot of great men, and the work that they did for the cause of Christ. And when we look at even before Christ, and we look back in the Old Testament, there's so many great examples for us of people who wanted to work for God, who took his word seriously, and to try to get other people on board as well, to get their families following the ways of God, to get their loved ones following the ways of God. The church grows when you think about it from the inside out. We can try to get as many people as we want, to be added to it, but the church really does work from the inside out. We need a strong infrastructure of the church. And even, looking at it in the local sense, we need a strong infrastructure of the congregation. And as long as we can start to establish that and secure that, it's going to be a great way to get other people to notice that, what might be different, or to notice things about it and make that decision to say, what I could become a part of is something different than anything that I have ever been a part of before. And the way we're going to look at this tonight in Romans chapter 1 are three different I am statements that Paul makes, urging us to courageously proclaim the truth. When Paul wrote this letter, he knew that there was going to be times that he would come under fire. He knew that there were going to be times when people would oppose him. He knew that there was going to be opposition to what the Lord's church would be, to the Christian faith, to the faith system that Paul would preach about. He understood this, but nonetheless, Paul made it a priority for himself and for those who would go with him on these missionary journeys to reach as many possible as he could. And he knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew that there were going to be things ahead, people that he would meet. There would be situations at hand that would be dangerous for him. It's interesting when you start doing mission work, and I'm not sure how many people here who have done overseas mission work, or we've done mission work can be right in our own states. But when you look at mission work, the number one question that anyone asks is it safe? Everyone asks. That's the first thing that usually will come out of their mouth when they start discussing mission work. You want to go to when I went to Russia, when I went to South Africa, New Zealand, you do consider these things. But that is always a question that comes out of people's mouth. And you know what? Paul probably wondered the same thing. And he probably was very mindful that in some areas he might not be received by those who opposed him. But nonetheless, Paul was a person who cared greatly about souls, and he knew that there was never going to be a time where he would be able to, where he could hang it up like that. Now look at Morgan this morning and how difficult that must be for an elder. And I look, and I compare him to Katie's grandfather, Tom, who has passed away. But Tom was, I always considered my grandfather, and he was such a great example to me. I mean, I loved him more than anything, and we had so many great talks, and he was a long-time elder. And it is hard to see an elder who has served so long to realize when it's time. It's tough to see that. And I know it was a decision that he did not take lightly. And I know the eldership that we have in place right now love him, and I know Jim, who has served with him for a long time. It's tough to see that. But nonetheless, even though he's not serving as an elder now, there's still great work in the church that can be done by someone of that age, by someone who is up there. And Paul realized it, that there is never a time in the church when we hang it up from trying to reach souls and trying to be that example. And as we look at these I am statements by Paul, which tell us how to be courageous, and look at his life and just how active he was, and how, just the depths that he would go to try to reach people. I hope that we can gain a great, that we can just gain, that we can use this as an example, that it can motivate us to reach people in the same way. The church needs to be a home of the brave, those who are willing to do whatever it takes under any circumstance to reach those who aren't. And we have been there, haven't we? We've reached people. We have family members that greatly oppose us, and we've had friends that have stood against us, and they have different ideas and so forth. What are we going to do? How much do we want them to get to heaven? At what lengths are we willing to go to get them to heaven? Now, we can't force them into that water, but we can try and pray and do everything that we can for them. And that is the attitude that Paul had for every single person. There was not an individual that went by. And Paul, remember, this is Paul who would go into the synagogues, and as we looked at last week, he would reason with them from the scriptures. In other words, he would get a group of people around, whether it's one person, whether it's multiple people, didn't matter to Paul. He did whatever he could to reach as many as he could. But every person that he would meet on an individual basis, he cared greatly about them. I'm called to remembrance for the, when he and Silas were in Philippi. You ever think about how profound that situation was when they were in prison? When they were tied in the stocks in the innermost part of the prison, and the one person who was there or one of the men who was there, I guess, to guard them, and these Roman soldiers were by no means anything to mess with. They were sadistic. They had it in mind to keep you where you were. That was their job. They had one job, and that was to make it as hard on you as they possibly could. And here was this Roman soldier who kept them in the stocks. And Paul and Silas could have died, and he wouldn't have cared. He would not have batted an eye. And yet when those bars shook, Paul and Silas were able to escape along with all the other prisoners. This Roman soldier, rather than face the consequences, was willing to die on his own sword. He was willing to commit suicide. How many would have been like Paul? Here was a man that had you in prison, and you had no idea what your life was going to be like, just trying to get out, thinking about, trying to get out of that. But you think it's bad in quarantine now. Think of being in those stocks, and just you have one thing on your mind, and that is to try to escape, to do whatever it takes to get out. And when those bars shook, he and Silas could have easily hightailed it out of town and got out of there and just never looked back at that, not care about that Roman soldier. Whatever happens to him, so be it. He had us in the stocks after all. He had us in prison. He made our life miserable. Why should I care about him? Whatever happens to him, just, face whatever you can, but we got to get out of here. But Paul saw an opportunity. He saw a man who did not know Christ, a man who was misled, and in turn, Paul tried to help him. And he saw this, not just this man, he had no idea what this home life was like. And how interesting it was that when he baptized the Philippian jailer, it wasn't just him, it was his whole household, wasn't it? How interesting that was to see that relationship develop. What kind of a conversation must that have been for Paul to turn back and turn to him and say, don't do it, because there's a better way. And to see that man go from wanting to just wanting to kill Paul and Silas, or not caring or being indifferent about the two of them, to having Paul as the most important person in his life that he could have ever met at that moment. And because of that, he became a Christian. A Roman soldier was converted to Christ. That is a deep situation to think about. Paul saw a man who needed to reach that land of the free. And Paul was brave enough to reach him. And why? Because Paul took on an attitude that he preached. And when you look at chapter 1, beginning in verse 14, we see that attitude. Paul said, I am the debtor, both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the unwise. Verse 14. When you look at this verse right here, Paul is telling them that I am obligated in a personal, moral way to make sure I've got the responsibility to make sure that every person that I meet, if I can do something about it, I'm going to do it. That is my personal obligation to them. When you look at this verse right here, it has to do with reflection. What kind of a Christian am I going to be to someone who's not? And how far am I willing to go? Because we know this world is full of people who do not like Christ. They could care less about the Bible. They're wrapped up in in lifestyles that sometimes we couldn't even comprehend. And I can either be judgmental towards them, or I can look at them as being souls worth saving. Paul didn't look at anyone as being less than he was. In fact, Paul came from that kind of a life, didn't he? This has everything to do with reflection right here. It's no wonder why Paul would feel this indebtedness after having the blood of so many Christians on his hands previously to this. You ever thought about that? This is why it was so important for him. Here was a man who made it his life to go in from house to house, to have people slaughtered simply because of what they believed, because they stood opposed to the government, because they had another faith system, what he did. In fact, it was a preacher whose death Paul was responsible for, it was Stephen. But when you find Christ and you realize the price that he paid for you, then you start to get it. That was one of the biggest things that I had to swallow for me when I became a Christian, because I could not comprehend anyone dying for me. I've heard religious sermons, I've heard Bible lessons, I heard them growing up, even though it was a false religion. But I've heard a lot of different lessons about Christ and a lot of different things about the Bible over my life. But when I finally started to realize the depth that Christ went for me, the love that he displayed, and he going to that cross because he wanted me to be saved, that's when you start to get it. That's when you start to have that breakthrough moment and realize that I've got to do everything it takes to get other people to understand that death. We have an obligation. That's what Paul had. Every person that Paul met, I wonder if that's what if that's what he thought. When he went on that road and he met the Christ and he starts to realize everything that had happened, and when he was baptized, what an amazing thing that was. To have Paul understood it. And he said there's no one that is exempt from hearing the gospel. He said it was, he says, I am debtor both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, the wise and the unwise. And this is interesting when you start, when you understand and start studying who the Greeks and the barbarians are, who the wise and the unwise are that he's referring to right here. The Greeks were educated. They, in fact, the Greeks were very well known to be artistic and well-versed, and anyone that was ignorant of their culture, the way that they saw it, anyone who was ignorant of their culture and anyone who was ignorant of their language, they saw as barbarians. They saw as just, this unsophisticated group, the ones who did not, they did not measure up. And here Paul is saying that I am a debtor, not just to the Greeks, the ones who needed, who are, this educated, but the ones who the Greeks looked at as being these barbarians, these simpletons, simple-minded. He says, I am debtor to them. And he says, I'm debtor to the wise, which is a reference to the philosophers of Greece. It also is a reference to those who are good. And he says, I am debtor to the unwise, those who are simple-minded, those who also had a lack of wisdom because of their moral fault. There are going to be people at fault morally that we meet. I owe them the gospel. You owe them the gospel. And when I can understand my purpose as a Christian, it opens doors that you never could even imagine. Understanding that you can get other people to heaven. Paul said, I am debtor to these people. Everyone deserves to hear and respond to the gospel. I am debtor to them. I owe them. The way that Paul talks about right here. But he doesn't stop there. Verse 15, he says, so much is in me, I am ready to preach the gospel to you who are at Rome also. And so Paul doesn't just say, you know what, I am debtor. I owe every person the obligation of showing them the gospel. Paul understood that not everyone was going to respond. But Paul understood Paul understood the attitude that he had to have, this reflection of it. And then upon having this reflection and understanding that he owes them, he says, I am ready to preach the gospel. This has to do with action. Paul said, I know what I have to do. Now I have to be willing to do it. There's a problem out there in the world. People don't have Christ. What are we going to do about it? I know we're not going to reach every single one of them. God knows we're not going to reach every single one of them. So I can either just clam up and say, well, I hope someone does. Or I can say, I'm going to reach who I can. I'm going to try with those who I know. Do something for me for just a minute. Think of one person in your life who is not a Christian. Just one. And most of you can probably think of something right off the bat, can't you? Just a name that just instantly comes to your mind. Some of us can think of a whole list of people, but you have that one person that you thought of right away. You know what? Make them the one person that you focus on. Can you imagine if every person in here focused on that one person and did everything that we can? Is it a guarantee they're going to turn and convert to Christ's gospel? No. But put in that effort to that person. Write them cards. You don't have to thump them over the head with the Bible. Some of them probably you've had those conversations with anyway, and they've ended frustratingly. Write them cards. Let them know. Something just as simple as, I'm praying for you. I can pray for you and I can love you and you can't do anything about it. But I'm going to pray for you. And you show them and do everything that you possibly can for that one person. And then you can open it up to more and understand if there's more people that you're able to work on. Paul said, I am debtor to people, but I'm going to do something about it. He was willing to do it. I am ready to preach the gospel to you too. We need to be ready to do the same. That word gospel, by the way, when he talks about this, is everything that the New Testament teaches. Paul understood what that was. And it implies, when we see that Paul says, I am ready to preach, how many gospels are right here that he talks about? Just one, isn't it? It's not a plurality of gospels. It's not, I'm just going to teach you, and you know what? You can go to your church over here. You can have this faith system over here, and you can just believe what you want over here. Paul said, I am ready to preach the gospel, which implies that there was only one faith system that was in existence when Paul taught it. You want to get someone to heaven? I'm going to have to find out what that one faith system is, and I got to teach it to them and make sure that they're on board with what the New Testament teaches. Because, folks, we have a lot of different things that are going on in the world today, but there's only one that's going to save. And it's right here in the inspired text that we have. I am ready to preach the gospel. Paul wanted to preach the truth to the church as well as he did the world. Isn't that interesting? Because when you look at this, a lot of Romans has to do with people who are already saved. People who are already in here. Now, Paul meant it for everyone. Remember, this is an open letter about how the only people who will be justified are those with the gospel, those who have accepted the gospel of Christ. But there were Christians that were reading this. There were Christians that in certain parts of Romans that we see that he was addressing, which means that I need to make sure that the person sitting next to me is going to heaven. And we can hold each other accountable. And I pray for me, and I can pray for you, and let's help each other grow spiritually. I am ready to preach the gospel. Some of the best lessons come from my best friends. I can tell you right now, some of the best lessons I've ever preached come from my wife. I wasn't supposed to let her know that this morning. I remember when she was when I was at Memphis School of Preaching, and she'd go to some of the classes with me, and she'd turn in outlines. She'd get better grades than some of the guys that were over there, and I'd find them, and I'd read it and say, wow. And so a couple of years later, I was preaching one, and she said, that sounds familiar. She didn't realize that it was one of hers. She said, that sounds pretty good. I said, well, it should. My son comes up with good ideas. We need to make sure that we get each other to heaven. Paul said, I am debtor to those, and I am ready to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome also, because every person, inside or outside of Christ, meant something to Paul. And the third one that we see right here, he says, I am not ashamed. In verse 16, I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. This has to do with integrity. You see, I can know what the world needs. I can even go so far as to be willing to say, okay, well, if the opportunity arises, I want to meet that opportunity, but when that opportunity comes up, when the rubber hits the road, what am I going to do? What am I going to say? Okay, now the opportunity's there. Now I have this person and they're asking questions about it. Or I have this person and maybe they're even disagreeing with me. Do I just say, well, okay, then, I'll just move on to the next person. You're okay. Paul said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. Regardless of some who hold the gospel in contempt, Paul said, I am not ashamed. There's your home of the brave right there, being tested. Paul was willing to endure some of the roughest opposition. Why? Look at this tail end of this verse. Because he knew not only that he could not be ashamed, but he said it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek. Why could Paul face this opposition and still keep on going? Why could he suffer all these different shipwrecks? Why could he face these stripes, being whipped over and over and over again, being punished? Why could he be put in the stocks? Why could he have all this, this physical abuse and verbal abuse coming to him and still not give up, and at the end of his life say, I have kept the faith and I have fought a good fight? Because Paul knew, as he expresses right here, that the gospel is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes. He saw a need and he met it. What are we going to do? We'll never face those whippings or the shipwrecks. We're going to face opposition, some probably worse than others. But can I face that and still say, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ? Preaching of the word has power to change your life. And when we can understand that, knowing what it did for each of us, that it changed my life, that's when we're able to turn it around and have it change someone else's. Church needs to be a home of the brave, to lead others to the land of the free. You want your loved ones to go to heaven? You need to make sure that you're going there first. Make sure that your life is secure spiritually. And make sure that your family, your loved ones, whoever it is, that one person on your list. And then as that list grows and you know more people and then more people that need to hear it. Everyone. Understand this. Just like Saul of Tarsus, who became Paul, everyone has the ability to repent. All of us have the ability to change our lives, to repent. It might take life-changing decisions, but you can do it. And everyone has the need to confess Christ without shame and to obey him, to understand that he and he only is the authority in all matters. And when we can get that and understand that to follow his word, to become righteous, to be baptized, and thus have him add us to his kingdom, he's the one that has to do it. Then we start to understand that the gospel is God's power to save. I want to ask you again tonight, as we did this morning, before you leave here, are you in that land of the free, being free from sin? And if you're not, or if there's something in your life that is hanging you up from being there, I want to encourage you to come forward and let us pray for you. That's what we do as a church family. Don't feel ashamed. Don't feel scared. Don't feel judged because no one's doing that. We've all been there, and we've all needed it. We've needed those prayers. We've needed that encouragement. I've needed it. And I thank the people that were there for me when it happened. You have that need tonight. Don't hesitate to come forward as we stand and sing this song of invitation.